when I was in graduate school, I was really interested in how people construct their lives. So how is it that people sort of choose to go in one direction or another in their life? And so values are really important to that, because values are guiding principles that help us decide what it is we like and what it is we're going to do tomorrow and the next day and with our lives. And there really, at that time, wasn't a whole lot of research in psychology about values, and so it was sort of an open field. And I got really interested especially in this question of which kind of values were good for people's well-being and which kind of values maybe hurt people's well-being. And that research turned out to be pretty interesting, and so I continued along with it and have been doing it for 20 years now. When I take a look at the personal values top 10, what I notice is that a lot of the values in there are what I would classify as the intrinsic values and what Schwartz would call the self-transcendent and the self-direction values. So for example, things like honesty and friendship and family and taking care of each other and listening and responsibility and trust, those are all values that Schwartz would call the benevolence values, or that we would call the affiliation values. And what we know is that in our research as well, those are values which almost always rise to the top in terms of what people say are very important to them. So I think that's interesting that you've confirmed that. The other kinds of values which pop up there are other intrinsic values. So for example, health is number 7. That's a value that we've identified in our research. And then respect and positive thinking. Those are more sort of personal growth kinds of values, or what Schwartz would call the self-direction values. So, and those also tend to be very important to most people across cultures. What's fascinating to me, and which confirms a lot of what I've been arguing for a while, when you look at what they say the values of contemporary society are, you see it's things like materialism and waste of resources and conflict and poverty, and pollution. Poverty really has to do with inequality. These are the values which I actually just finished talking about in my talk on capitalism. We live in a culture which is very focused on trying to make a profit, on economic growth, on consumerism, and those are the things that keep the wheels of our society rolling around, and people are recognizing that, right? And what's interesting is to note how people are essentially saying, I live in a society which is counter to the things that are important to me. I live in a society which does not support my values. And is there any wonder that 20% of people are depressed? Is there any wonder that there's so much anxiety and upset in our culture? If we live in a culture which doesn't support our values, then we're going to constantly be butting our heads against things, not getting our needs satisfied, and not being very happy. And of course, the rest of society is doing a lot of bad things out there in terms of pollution. But then when you take a look at the ideal society, what do you see? Again, those intrinsic values coming up: concern about future generations, concern about health, quality of life, honesty, peace, etc. So you're back to those intrinsic values. So to me, this is really a hopeful message, which is that people don't want the consumer society, the hyper-capitalism that we have in so many societies, not just in Flanders. They want something different. So the question is, how can we get there? How can we create what Martin Luther King called a revolution of values and switch our society around? I think there are a couple different reasons why there hasn't been that kind of revolution. I think first off, people are scared, and there's lots in politics and in the media which make them scared. And one of the things we know that happens from the research when people are scared is they orient towards values like money and status and power and the rest. And I think there's good evolutionary reasons for that. So that's one of the reasons. I think a second reason is that we're pounded with these commercial messages so much that it comes to the point where most people think that it's normal. And a lot of people, I really think a lot of people, if you looked at if you had asked another question on there, like, what do you really believe other people want? Not just contemporary society, but what other people want. I think most people believe that they're kind of different than their neighbor. They think, well, I care about honesty, and I care about peace, and I care about this, but they think that most other people are caring about the money and the power and the status. So it becomes difficult for them to stand up and say, hey, what I want is this different society, because they're going to think, oh, they're going to think that you're going to say, oh, you're crazy for that. When in fact, the chances are that you're going to say, oh, that's what I want too. Our society makes it really difficult for us to connect with each other around values and find out that we actually do all want the same thing. And people are very social creatures, and it's going to become way easier when organizations like your own have been able to show that actually most everybody wants the same stuff. Why don't we all work together? Because I think that can help us overcome our fear. The last thing I would say, I mean, again, I could say a lot on this, but the last thing I would say is those in power want to keep power. Those who are making lots of profit off of the way the system works are the ones who largely get the ones in power into power so that they can keep making a lot of profit. Okay? So the system is run by some people who maybe don't share the values that we share. And we need to get those people out of power one way or another, non-violently, obviously, but there are lots of ways we can make those kinds of changes if we can really kind of find the courage in ourselves. Research shows that when people feel threatened, they actually, most of the time, orient towards extrinsic values for materialism more than towards intrinsic values. So actually, the financial crisis, on the whole, is going to move people towards extrinsic rather than towards intrinsic. And there's lots of research which supports that. People who grow up in poverty are more extrinsically oriented. Brief reminders of money move people away from intrinsic values. We've done experiments where we've threatened people about economic hardship. That makes them more extrinsic. So the financial crisis and the fear that that engenders is actually likely, in most cases, to move people in a more extrinsic fashion. We have some data that showed that that's what happened in Iceland, too, when their economy collapsed. Okay? Way worse than it collapsed almost anywhere else. Okay? That said, there's a little bit of data that show that a crisis can move people in an intrinsic fashion if people take that crisis and they use it as an opportunity to reflect on their values and to reflect on whether or not they've been living a life like they want to live a life. And if the situation around them supports that continued reflection, that can move them in a more intrinsic fashion. That's not what's happened in this financial crisis. That's not what happened after the September 11th attacks in the United States. Okay? It was, don't reflect, go out and hurt people. Don't reflect, go out there and start shopping again, consume more, get corporations back on their feet. Okay? So you had a crisis which was followed by a narrative that said more extrinsic. If you could have a crisis that got people, that shook people up, but then helped them reflect, then that's the kind of thing that, psychologically speaking, should lead to these kinds of value shifts. But our leaders don't generally like us to reflect. Well, one of the things we know about values and the way that they're organized in a person's mind is that they're kind of like a seesaw. So as one goes up, the other one tends to go down. And it's relatively difficult to simultaneously pursue conflicting values. And we also know from the research that some of the conflicting values are the focus on money and greed and trying to pursue your own self-interest versus the focus on the community and trying to benefit other people. Now again, from day to day, a person can move, one day they're focused on one and the other one another day they're focused on the other value. But the more you tend to inhabit one part of that value system, the harder it's going to be to spend much time in the other part of it. Okay? I think what happened with Bill Gates, in my sense, is that he spent a whole lot of time really focused on maximizing profit at pretty much any cost. When you take a look at the way he lived his life, when you take a look at certain practices that Microsoft has been accused of engaging in, etc., very clearly a focus on maximizing profit and self-interest. But there came a point where that didn't hold for Bill Gates anymore, and he didn't want to do that anymore. And what's interesting is that he puts himself outside of that environment, okay? He stops putting himself in an environment where the focus is money, money, and status and all of the rest. And then he can switch to another kind of set of values, those more intrinsic pro-social values. Interestingly, you see the same thing happened with Andrew Carnegie, actually. Carnegie was extremely focused on maximizing wealth in the first part of his life, realized the damage it was doing to him, and decided he wasn't going to do that anymore. He was going to focus on giving it all away. So again, it's very difficult to do them both in a high-intensity fashion at the same time because they're opposing motives. I want to get everything I can from you is very different than I want to give everything I can to you. It's hard to do them both at the same time psychologically. I'm really glad that Bill Gates has switched over. Well, what we know from the values research over time, there aren't many good longitudinal studies. There are a couple. But what we know from studies that kind of compared 10-year-olds to 18-year-olds to 30-year-olds, et cetera, is that the extrinsic values start to increase in importance around the teenage years, okay? And they tend to go up, and then they tend to remain relatively stable over time, and then start to drop. Maybe they drop a little bit in your late 20s, and then they actually go up again a little bit at the end of life, the research suggests. Now, throughout this, for most people say that intrinsic values are more important to them than extrinsic values. Not everybody, but most people do. So I think that we have to understand this increasing focus on materialism in the context of still caring about intrinsic values. I think the difficulty people experience is figuring out how to live their life in an intrinsic way. The exact issue of what gets somebody to switch in quite the way that Bill Gates seemed to switch, I think is an interesting one that needs a lot more exploration. It goes back actually to what we were talking about with these crises in some part. I think that people sometimes go through these crises. There's really interesting work on something called post-traumatic growth. Sometimes after people have had a trauma, they get way worse. But sometimes they get better. They actually grow. And most people who experience post-traumatic growth give up on the extrinsic values and they move to the intrinsic values. So I do think that these kinds of things can happen to switch people around.